Let me go to myth number 1. So human carbon dioxide, our emissions are too small to really matter. So first off, what's interesting is we have data for at least 500,000 years or longer that shows that CO2 has never gotten above 300 parts per million in the atmosphere. Right now we're about 387 parts per million in the atmosphere. The other thing that they were able to measure between the late 1800s and the mid-1950s was that there was a noticeable drop in carbon-14 in the atmosphere. Carbon-14 is emitted by plant materials, but when you burn fossil fuels, since carbon-14 is an unstable isotope, meaning it has a half-life of 6,000 years, the more fossil fuels you'll burn does not actually contain carbon-14, so we actually had a real drop in carbon-14 in the atmosphere, even though we were producing more. Since then, though, we have had an increase because of nuclear tests and other sorts of nuclear experiments that have increased the carbon-14 in the atmosphere. Another interesting data point, human beings emit about 100 times the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere than what volcano emissions emit. So the idea that volcanoes somehow have been causing global warming is untrue. And finally, about 40% of all the CO2 that human beings emit get absorbed by carbon sinks, primarily the oceans and also land-based sources. Of that, we've already noticed a 30% acidification of our oceans, meaning they are not able to absorb all the CO2, and it's starting to acidify the oceans, which already we've already talked about the national security implications, thank you, of acidification in our oceans. Number 2, the idea that there is nothing we can do about global warming. Well, first off, we already have several decades in the pipeline. We've already experienced over 1.5 degrees centigrade over the last century. We're expecting 3 to 4 more degrees if we're on a low emissions path. 30% of our ice caps have already diminished, and spring is coming about 8 hours earlier annually. So these processes are already occurring. What we're trying to do is avoid the tipping point, which the IPCC says is basically a 2 degrees increase in centigrade, which we're hearing already that could technically wipe out our coral reefs. So this tipping point, scientists like James Hansen out of the NASA Goddard Institute, Bill McKibben and others are saying this 450 parts per million level, which would get us to 2 degrees, is probably too high. Safety zone is maybe 350. But again, based on the IPCC projections, we're looking at about 500 parts per million. So we're going to need to reevaluate those targets. But anyway, what I do want to point out is there are precedents. One is our international work on reducing ozone pollution, which has relatively been successful up until the last couple years. Right now, this year, we just got a report that our ozone hole is the second largest ever, and it's partly due to aerosols coming out of China and Russia. So already, even though we've been making headway, we're starting to go backwards again. But anyway, political will is needed. We dropped out of the Kyoto Accords. The U.S. has not been able to pass any sort of federal legislation. We just had the RGGI program here that happened in the Northeast, and now transitioning that at the federal level is a top priority.
This excerpt is brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law, the leader of reform in legal education and a leader in multimedia education for the public. To view the full interview and for a full listing of MSL's programs, log on to mslaw.edu.